All right. Well, hello. Nice to meet you, and congratulations on the movie.
Thanks very much. Lovely to meet you.
Oh, and congratulations on the award win too at the festival. I just saw
Oh,
that. That's
thanks.
awesome.
Yeah, it's very nice.
I loved the movie. I'm gonna start out with just like a basic question here, but did you have any particular films that you look to for inspiration for Censor, either during that craze or even currently right now?
Yeah, I mean, when I was working on the film, like at the script stage, there were various different influences for different things. I mean, one of the most abstract and unusual influences was actually Watership Down, the
Okay.
film about rabbits.
Yeah.
But it was a really big influence for me for like the sound and the world of the censor's office and this kind of strange underground warren of censors with like in Watership Down you have the whispers of rabbits kind of going through the tunnels in that film, but in the censor's office we have the screams of people being murdered in films in like the next room.
Yeah.
So that was kind of, you find these films that sometimes can be like a way into a scent aspect, but obviously the film, the nature of Censor, the setting and the period means I was going back and watching a lot of the video nasties. Um, so Lucio Fulci's work and Argento's work were definitely revisited a lot in terms of looking at the kind of design of the films within the film and stuff like that. And then for the kind of psychological unraveling of the main character, I was looking at films like Let's Scare Jessica to Death and Black Swan.
Okay.
The Piano Teacher as well, I thought was a great reference for the character in terms of this very hard-shelled woman who we slowly see crack.
Mhm.
So yeah, you kind of, it's like a pick a mix of different things that help you along the way. But I also tend to look at photography and painting and music, and lots of things can be inspiring.
Yeah, that's so funny. I never would have pegged Watership Down as an inspiration, but I kind of love it. I see it the way you described it, so that's really cool. But yeah, placing a film censor at the center of the horror film was like I found it quite ironic, but also we're put like in a position where we become like sympathetic towards Enid and her job at the ending, despite the fact that she's kind of doing something that many people who watch the movie would probably kind of hate. So like what drew you to kind of spotlight a film censor and Enid as a character in the movie?
Yeah, it's funny, isn't it? When I was writing it, I was thinking, oh God, this is the horror fans' enemy that I'm trying to get the horror fans who go on a journey with. But really, it was this idea of making a film about a film censor that was where I started. It wasn't starting with the era or the video nasties. It was the character of a film censor. I'd been reading an article about the Hammer horror era, and it was talking about the fact that they didn't have many guidelines or rules during this period, but one of their rules was that the sight of blood on the breast of a woman would be cut from films because they believed it would make men likely to commit rape. And I thought, well, surely there were a number of male film censors working during this period. So if these images are supposed to have this effect on us, what protects the censor from losing control? And what if a censor believed so much in censorship, they started to have a strange relationship with the material that they're viewing on screen and have a kind of darker conversation with their moral compass, start to doubt themselves. Maybe they start to wonder if deep down they're not necessarily a good person. And from there, that's kind of was the beginning of the idea. And then I started to read about censorship. But they're unusual people, film censors. There are not many of them, in each country that do this job. It's very, unique and niche. And they're watching these films with both an objective and a subjective viewpoint. It's such a strange job to do. It really fascinates me, and I really saw it as a way into talking about our relationship with horror and our relationship with the kind of things that we watch in films.
Yeah, and it's really interesting too, because I think that in some ways censorship is kind of its own form of violence against the artist of a piece of work. And so that kind of, there was that kind of interesting tension there. And I wondered if that was something that was on your mind while you were doing this movie.
Yeah, 100%. And also in terms of, I wasn't just looking at censorship in art and films. I wanted to look at self-censorship and the way that I mean, in the same way that I'm talking about this film censor who starts to question whether they're deep down a bad person, that in that sense, that character starts to censor themselves, because if deep down you think you're a bad person, you're going to be trying to hide that from other people. So that's what Enid's doing. She's kind of constructed herself to censor the parts of herself that she doesn't think are palatable. And to a certain extent, I think we all do that. We all have parts of ourselves that we don't get out in certain situations. But there's an unhealthiness to self-censorship, and there's an unhealthiness to censorship. I think it's much more, it's much more balanced and healthy to become at peace with the parts of yourself that you maybe don't like so much, and your shadow self, I suppose. And I think in many ways, film and art provides a space where people should and can be uncensored, but we have these people that kind of police that to a certain extent anyway. And definitely in the UK in the 80s, they were the film police.
Yeah. And then you also have I feel like there was this kind of underlying theme of censorship within Enid's family too, not talking about Nina and the missing sister and kind of wanting to ignore that. And I thought that really added an interesting dynamic. And I guess what inspired you to sort of bring in that family dynamic? Because you could have so focused just to choose on Enid because there was so much there. But I really thought that aspect was interesting. And I wanted to hear your thoughts on that as well.
Well, yeah, because you're talking about a situation within a family that's caused so much pain, and they don't have the answers, and they haven't found a way to be able to talk about it openly. I always knew when I was writing the script very early on that I wanted to find something from Enid's childhood that she couldn't access, that there was a memory that she'd censored or her brain had censored on her behalf. And so myself and my co-writer, Anthony Fletcher, we were kind of exploring different ideas and things that maybe she had happen to her family. And eventually we landed in this idea of her sister disappearing and this idea of not having an answer, which then means that you're filling that gap in your memory, but also in reality, and not knowing what happened to somebody. You're filling that with fiction. You're filling it with your imagination. You're constantly, worrying around whether or not she was, kidnapped, whether she's dead, whether you did something to her yourself, and that's again feeding into the kind of themes that I wanted to explore in the film, which are to do with the relationship between fiction and reality, and that conversation that goes on between fiction and reality that can have a real life effect, in terms of a person's behavior and actions. So, it was fun to kind of slowly figure all of that out as we wrote the script.
Yeah. And speaking of, Nina's, you never really find out what happened to the sister. Did you guys think of something that happened, but choose not to reveal it? Or did you guys leave that ambiguous to yourselves as well to kind of stay in that headspace of Enid?
I think to tell a story, you have to know what happened. As the filmmaker, you have to have your version in your head of what this event and what happened on that day. But I always wanted to keep the audience in Enid's perspective, because the reality of somebody going missing is people don't have that closure. And that is what has driven Enid to this point. That is the ultimate horror of censor, is ambiguous loss and not knowing. And so it felt inauthentic for me to tie that all up in a neat little bow. But also it's much more interesting, I think, for the audience to leave and have a conversation around what they think might have happened, and which way people go in that sense is really interesting. Some people, really think that Enid could have done something to her sister that day because that's what Enid is questioning in herself. And then other people don't think that at all. And I've, heard of people kind of having these debates around the film. And that was always the intention. That was always really exciting to me, to have the reality of it left open like it is for Enid.
Yeah, and I mean, you even leave the audience in a similar position. You kind of give Enid like almost a happy ending in some sort of way, where she kind of does reunite with Nina, but then you have those terrifying like jump cuts of like, did Enid kidnap Alice the actress and all of that stuff. I think. And it drove home this idea that censorship and like the cultivation of it, like kind of creates a fascination that's something that might otherwise not be there. How did you like land on this specific ending where you kind of have both the good and the bad that mirrors that videotape that she sees in that store earlier?
It's a slow weaving and figuring it out as you're writing. There were a few different endings as we wrote the script, and I remember not being happy with them. And then I think one weekend I sat down and I just discovered the album Blank Mass by Blank Mass, which we used one of the tracks from that album over the end of the film. It's called Chernobyl. I discovered that album and I just had it on my headphones for about 3 days, and it just all kind of it all unraveled over that weekend. And but it's slowly kind of weaving these ideas into each other, basically. I'm glad you noticed those little nods, because again, those are the things you discover as you keep working on the script, and you think, if you're talking about like the way that fiction and reality can kind of echo into each other, it's fun to have those little Easter eggs within the film. So that image that she looks at, that's everything she could ever want, is what happens and is created at the end. I kind of always knew I wanted to give Enid a happy ending of some sort, but it had to be laced with something very melancholic and unsettling, because ultimately she can't have a happy ending. She can't have closure because we don't know what happened to her sister.
Definitely. And speaking of like, I guess like that tension between fiction and reality, I recently like read this article about like social media moderators who they have to sit there and watch like this like extremely violent content that's like uploaded to platforms like Facebook and things like that, and like the psychological toll that sort of takes on them. And I thought that was really interesting because today we still even have like this moral panic around like video games and things like that they cause violence in society. Were you thinking about those like sort of modern parallels today, while sort of, I mean, it's really interesting because you're mining this really specific time period, but also it still resonates today in a really interesting way. And how did you kind of marry those two?
Yeah, 100%. Also, you look back at history in the 50s, it was comic books that were going to make little boys turn into bad little boys and do terrible things. So it's happened throughout history that we think that, on one side you could say, do we think that we're so fragile, that our moral compass is so fragile that we're going to play a video game or watch a film or read a comic book or listen to some, hip hop or Marilyn Manson music and then suddenly decide that we're going to go out and hurt somebody? The reality is those things aren't the thing that make people do violent and awful things to each other. That actually it's much easier to blame art. It's much easier to use art and entertainment as a scapegoat rather than actually try and unpick the social and personal issues that make people become unwell and do these kinds of things to each other. So it's definitely a huge conversation. And I was also thinking about those people, the cleaners, of social media, and the idea that in a way they are the modern day, censors from this period. Because in the 80s, these censors, they didn't know what was going to pop up next in these films, you know, and sometimes you have a film like Faces of Death where there is real footage of, you know, animals being hurt and that kind of thing. Whereas you wouldn't get that so much now as a film censor because we have so many laws. But the internet is just a dark place where you can pretty much find anything that you want to. If you want to see something, you can see it.
Yeah.
And those are the kind of modern day Enids in a way.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I think that's our time. And I just want to say thank you so much for sitting down with me. I really appreciate it. I loved the movie. Congratulations. And thank you so much.
Thank you. It's a pleasure. Nice to meet you.